Okay, can we have your attention, please? Please take your seats. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker today, John Negroponte, familiar to many of you, Vice Chair of McLarty Associates and the former Director of National Intelligence of the United States. Ambassador Negroponte is well acquainted with geopolitical crises and challenges from a 45-year career in government service, both abroad and in Washington. Abroad, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Honduras, Mexico, the Philippines, the UN, and Iraq. Not exactly low-stress assignments. In Washington, he served on the National Security Council, and I guess to relax, you did the Vietnam gig for the Nixon administration, and then Deputy National Security Advisor under President Reagan. He was appointed the first Director of National Intelligence by President George W. Bush, and later served that administration as Deputy Secretary of State. He's also held teaching positions at Yale, George Washington University, University of Virginia, and Georgetown. The ambassador has also received many awards in recognition of his public service, including the Distinguished Service Medal of the State Department and the National Security Medal for his outstanding contributions to U.S. national security. And just a couple of notes for our shipping audience. He was once a claims adjuster for Frank B. Hall for a summer. And a final but notable attribute for many of us, his father's family is descended from the Greek island of Chios. Right. Please welcome, you see we got a lot of Chiotes in.
Yeah, well.
Please welcome Ambassador John Negroponte.
Thank you, John. And yeah, my father, in addition to his family being from Chios, had the prescience to be born on March 25th, Greek Independence Day. Yeah, a good choice on his part, don't you think? And his father, our family left Chios during the massacre of 1822 and ended up in Russia. And my grandfather, my father's father, was born in Taganrog. And when I study the map, I see that it's right next. It's like an hour's drive from Mariupol, where all that heavy fighting was going on in Ukraine. So it's kind of interesting to see, you know, back to the future kind of thing. Look, I don't have a prepared speech, but I did make some notes. And I made notes mainly on China, on the one hand, and Russia and on the other. And I want to start in this way by saying that when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was ambassador to Mexico. John mentioned the various ambassadorships that I'd held. And I remember one of the receptions we gave for a visiting delegation or something, we had the famous Mexican author, philosopher, Octavio Paz, came to the event, and I remember maybe a little bit too triumphantly, but just sort of in a satisfied way, saying that what a wonderful thing it was that the Berlin Wall had collapsed and that the Soviet Union was in the process of collapsing and so forth. And Paz just looked at me with a very straight face and very seriously. He says, just remember, history does not stop. And so, you know, we're busy learning some of that just about every day, and we will for the rest of our lives. And certainly in a kind of an interesting way, both in the case of China and in Russia, I think we're seeing a sort of a throwback, at least in terms of political leadership, to the previous century. Xi Jinping is, this is the return of the ideologue running China, and Putin, of course, is the man who thought that the most catastrophic development of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So both of them are really cut from a mold, at least in part, of the kind of leaders that we knew back in the previous century. I first got to know a bit about China when I went to Hong Kong as a vice consul in 1961. And I went back, and so at that time, Hong Kong, of course, was a crown colony, and there was sort of a bamboo curtain that kept us separate from Hong Kong, and hardly anybody could go back and forth across the border, except perhaps household employees who were going back to see their relatives on Chinese New Year. You'd see a lot of that happening. But other than that, there was no movement back and forth between Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China. And so China was an enigma. And we didn't have satellites deployed then, let alone balloons. And so we didn't really know what was happening in China. And there were some pretty serious debates, for example, about whether there was a famine in China at that time. Of course, we all know now, and we knew pretty shortly thereafter, that China was suffering from a terrible famine. But the only way, just to give you a little bit of a picture of the state of intelligence collection in those days, the only way we could learn about what was happening in China was by reading the newspapers and sort of doing a sort of kind of Kremlinology. We gathered every Chinese newspaper we could. We rented the basement of the British American Tobacco Company, and we had a group of people translating the news stories for glimpses of what might be happening in the People's Republic of China. And the other way was interviewing refugees, which turned out to be a pretty good way of getting a sense of what was happening. But there were no satellites, there was no over-the-horizon capability of any particular kind. That it came fairly shortly thereafter, but it didn't exist when I was there. My next venture into Chinese-related matters was, I went with Dr. Kissinger. I was on the National Security Council staff, and I was, as John mentioned, the Vietnam guy. I directed the Vietnam office as we negotiated the end of our involvement in the war. And so he took me to a lot of places, and certainly when he went to Russia or China, he usually had me along. And so I went in '72 and was had the good fortune of attending one of his meetings with Zhou Enlai, the storied premier of China at the time, a man who impressed me a great deal, as a matter of fact. But that was my sort of next exposure to dealing with China. And then fast forward to the end of the Bush 43 administration, I was the Deputy Secretary of State, and I was responsible for the strategic political dialogue with the People's Republic of China. And I conducted my talks with Mr. Dai Bingguo, who was at the time was, first he was the Deputy Foreign Minister, he was sort of equivalent position to mine. He was one of the deputies. And then he got promoted to State Counselor, which is above the Foreign Minister. But he said he wanted to continue his talks with me. So for a couple of years, I had a very interesting time talking about the U.S.-China relationship. Well, it goes without saying, from 1961 until the present, and particularly since we established relations with the People's Republic in 1979, that China has enjoyed absolutely spectacular growth, economic growth, and there's no way of comparing what was happening. I mean, when you went to China in '72 with Mr. Kissinger and we stayed in the government guest houses, if you left a pad of paper in your room, the person who was taking care of your room as the motorcade was about to leave the guest house, they come running out to give you back this pad of paper because they thought it was something of high value, and they were afraid of also perhaps being accused of having stolen it. I mean, they thought of it as something of tremendous. I mean, they were poor as church mice, and they all wore Mao tunic kind of uniforms, and the only cars you saw in the streets belonged to official Chinese people high in the Communist Party. The year 2000, I think, is a real threshold period when China joins the World Trade Organization, and we grant them permanent trading status under our legislation. And I think that's when things took off even more. And then the situation sort of turned, if you will, after the first decade of this century. And I think it's sort of for, well, the principal reason I would say is the advent of Xi Jinping as the leader of the People's Republic. But I'd also say that we, too, started to shift our attitude towards China, and there was more of a debate about whether we were really in a win-win situation with China, and weren't there elements, perhaps, of a zero-sum game here that we needed to be careful about. And I think my recollection is that one of the areas where we saw it the soonest, and we've been talking about cyber, was where we saw so much intellectual property being stolen from various American companies through hacking and other forms of espionage. And I think that caused us quite a bit of concern. But you also have just the fact of a ideological leader taking office. At first, he was kind of low-key, but he became, he was head of the party, then he became president of the country, and now he's been president for 10 years, and he's going to be president for as long as he wants. It sounds like some people say he might want to do it for life. I'm not certain, but in any case, they've become more ideological. And a good friend of mine, Nicholas Lardy, wrote a book a number of years back called Markets Over Mao. There was a point where we thought that the sort of market approach to economic affairs was sort of taking hold in China. And I think there was quite a bit of truth to that at one point. But it's not true now. And what's happening in China now is that state-owned enterprises and the state corporations and so forth are getting the lion's share of investment. Private investment in China is going down. It's still growing slightly, but it's not anywhere near its previous levels. And I think China is losing an economic growth opportunity, if you will, in order to protect its ideological base. Now, this is not to say that the Chinese economy is not growing. I mean, of all the countries during COVID and after, China has probably got one of the most impressive records. The overall economy grew something like 15% during the past 3 years. But it is looking ahead, it's going to probably have a slightly lower growth rate going forward. But I wouldn't write the Chinese economy off by any means in the future. Their trade account grew also. I think the percentage of international trade today of global trade is greater than it was before, and so forth. So there's still a very strong economy, and obviously I'm not in a position to identify specifically where that would affect shipping, but clearly it does. And of course, China is a major customer of all sorts of important commodities, and I know that many of you follow that information very, very closely. Concurrent with this advent of Xi Jinping and our so-called pivot towards Asia, and it really starts under Mr. Obama, and it starts under the influence of a scholar, diplomat called Kurt Campbell, Dr. Kurt Campbell, who wrote a book about the pivot towards Asia, and he's a Japan expert, but he's also really in the forefront of those who are trying to constrain China going forward. He's pretty much the architect, I would say, of the policies you see coming out of Washington vis-a-vis China. And I know you're going to have some discussion later on today about our policies towards China, but there's definitely an effort to cramp China's style and to probably one of the best things you could read about that right now, and it's a very entertaining book, is called The Chip War by, I can't remember his last name anymore, but it's a bestseller. It's very, very good. He was a PhD student at Yale when I was teaching there, Chris Miller. And it's a commendable book and very sound. It sounds very sound to me, at least technically, even though he's more of a international relations expert, but he's done very, very good research. In any event, we're now faced with a situation where we're confronted with China talking about wanting to be the preeminent regional and global power by mid-century, and that included in that thinking is the suggestion that one way or another they'd like to prevail over Taiwan and realize their aspiration to reunify or unify Taiwan back with the People's Republic. That's probably the most serious flashpoint that exists between China and ourselves and our allies. I think that it's a matter of speculation as to if or when that might happen. I don't think it necessarily will. I get a little bit worried that our whole dialogue about Taiwan has sort of turned on the question of whether we're, how to prepare for a war vis-a-vis China if Taiwan is attacked. I'd like to see a little bit more discussion between the United States and China about these issues. I saw the glimmerings of some kind of softening of the rhetoric on the part of Xi Jinping recently. And then, of course, this darn balloon came across our continent and is now given pretext for canceling Secretary Blinken's trip to China, and it may have undone an opportunity to have some useful dialogue between the two countries. If you go back to the Shanghai Communique in 1972 that was negotiated by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, it made one principal point, and that was that the cross-straits situation between China and Taiwan should be resolved by peaceful means. That's the foremost statement in that communique, and I think that's a sound idea and would be a sound policy. But somehow right now, rather than getting back closer to that way of talking and thinking, we seem to be more moving in a little bit of a warlike approach to things. Now, speaking of the possibility of war, I can't imagine China trying to attack Taiwan at this particular point in time, because I think the atmosphere in Washington, the attitude is one of, they used to say it was strategic ambiguity, and we didn't want to let the Taiwanese know whether or not we would come to their defense, because we didn't want them to do anything provocative that might cause some trouble. And we still don't answer that question unambiguously as a matter of policy. But every time President Biden is asked, will you come to Taiwan's defense if it's attacked by China, he says, sure. He's done it a half a dozen times. And then the little stuff goes on in the background saying, well, what the president really meant to say, and things like that. But I think he has eliminated some of the so-called, he's gotten rid of some of the ambiguity in strategic ambiguity, and I would listen to the president more than the official policy. And that's my sense of it. And I think China has that sense also, and the things we've done to enhance Taiwan's military capabilities, defensibility, and so forth are now pretty substantial. I just was in the Philippines last week for a meeting with little organization we have called the U.S.-Philippines Society that promotes U.S.-Philippines relations. I'm the U.S. co-chair. And just the day after we finished our meetings, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin came to Manila and announced that under it's an enhanced defense cooperation agreement that we have with the Philippines, and under the terms of that agreement, they've identified, I think, 4 or 6 more bases in the Philippines to which our forces will have access in order to pre-position stocks of war materials and so forth, and which we could also use for our aircraft and other military equipment to come into the Philippines in case of some kind of Taiwan contingency, because the bases identified, a number of them are in the very northern part of the Philippines. And if you go to the northernmost part of the Philippines, you can practically see Taiwan looking out to your north. So Philippines is going to end up being part of this situation as well. But I hope it doesn't come to that. I think there's still time for the sides to talk through the Taiwan situation and find some way to cool the temperature a little bit. I haven't talked about the South China Sea. I'm not sure I know really what to say about it. I'm not aware, unless some of you tell me, that navigation in those waters and in the South China Sea area has been somehow seriously impeded by China's political position. The Philippines has won a case before the arbitral tribunal in the Law of the Sea tribunal in The Hague, and therefore its legal position has been vindicated, although that hasn't necessarily changed the situation on the ground. But it's there. It's an important decision by the arbitral tribunal, and it's forever. No one's going to take that away from them. And if attitudes or governments ever change in China, maybe there can be some kind of adaptation or adjustment of their own legal position, because, as you know, they essentially claim pretty much the entire South China Sea as their own private lake. There's nothing we can really do about it at this particular point, and most of the islands and the features that they use to make these claims are pretty much uninhabitable places. If you've seen some of the airfields that they've grown on, they almost have to create islands in order to be able to use these places for military purposes. Just a word about Russia. I don't think you can't really talk about Russia without talking about Vladimir Putin. And here's another throwback to the last century. He was a KGB agent. I think that's always been one of his most important loyalties. As I said earlier, he's a nostalgic person for the situation that existed before the end of the Cold War. He feels that collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy that has ever struck Russia and the Soviet Union. So he's really a figure from the past. Now, he started, I think that what really set him off, and I was Deputy Secretary of State at the time, was the Bucharest NATO meeting in 2008, when, although the NATO countries didn't put the Ukraine or Georgia on a specific path towards NATO membership, they did say in their final communique that those two countries will eventually become NATO members. And it wasn't very long after that NATO meeting that fighting broke out in Georgia, and the Russians invaded part of that country, and there's still a couple of areas that they occupy and have created what I guess you might call a frozen conflict in that country. And it's clear that Putin was very, very upset by what happened in with that NATO meeting. Georgia was the first signal of his displeasure, and it was not obviously on the scale of what happened in Ukraine, but Ukraine was really, for him, an even much more serious situation. And you know, he's telegraphed his punches all along the way for the past 20 years. I mean, you go back and look at speeches that he's given in Davos, in Munich, these global conferences back 2008, I think, was one of his famous speeches in Munich. His writings about the identity that the Russians and the Ukrainians have with each other. He makes the argument that these are the same peoples, have a common history, a common fraternity. So when he finally did invade, or they invaded on February 24th last year, I don't think we can say it was a big surprise in terms of what Putin had said over the years about his thinking. But the wars yielded, as you know, some interesting surprises. I mean, the first is that the Russians didn't win right away. And I think that's kind of what a lot of people assumed. And you'll recall that the White House and the State Department offered Zelensky a place to stay, right? And I forget what his quip was, but it was really quite good. He said, I don't want a place to stay, I want ammunition, and I want military supplies. And the second surprise, if you will, maybe we shouldn't be surprised, was that the Ukrainians have shown amazing resilience and bravery in what they're doing, and I think everybody's now sort of getting more used to that fact. And I guess thirdly, the Europeans, NATO members, particularly Germany, but others as well, have really rallied to the cause in a rather interesting way. There was a certain reluctance at the beginning, but today I think you see a very unified and vigorous European approach towards helping the country of Ukraine. And I guess another way of putting it is that they have taken the Ukraine situation as an existential threat to Western Europe. So going back to the original statement I made about history doesn't stop, you sort of want to ask yourself, where is all this going to go? And I don't think there's any certainty in this. You could have a sort of a stalemated situation, a ceasefire, maybe some kind of prolonged armistice without any of the really deep political issues being solved initially. You could conceivably have a victory, however you choose to define it, by one side or the other. Ukrainians succeed in driving out the Russians or driving out the Russians from as many places that would satisfy them to finally come to terms. That could be drive them out of Ukraine entirely, I don't know. Or the Russians might achieve some kind of military objective that would satisfy them. Or conceivably, and we can't really write anything off, the war could extend beyond the borders of Ukraine itself, although I wouldn't assign a very high probability to that. But I don't think we know the answer. And I think we've also been a bit humbled by the developments of the past year in terms of our inability to foresee exactly what might happen. I think the last point I would make is that the United States is in a good position given this international juncture. It's not ideal because there are a lot of risks out there. Even loose talk sometimes about people using nuclear weapons. So that's almost by definition not a happy situation, and you'd like to dial all this back to a little bit more sober conversation by all concerned. But given these circumstances, I think we're in pretty good shape. We have a very strong economy. In case we didn't believe it, we saw the employment figures of the other day, which were quite amazing. We have a strong military, strong and experienced military, and which has done an incredible job of training the Ukrainian army since the loss of Crimea. And then in that interval, that time was used very well for training the Ukrainian forces. And our alliances and partnerships around the world are probably in about as good shape as they've been in a long time. If you think of Europe and ourselves being pretty much on the same page about what to do about these things, and the strengthening of our alliances with the East Asia Pacific region, Japan now wanting to make a greater military contribution to its own security and to security of the region. This new Quad, so-called, with partnership with India and Australia and ourselves and the United Kingdom, and then this AUKUS alliance between us, Australia, and the UK. So there's a lot going on out there, a lot more tension from the West, and a unique feature of our relationship with the world is the system of alliances that we created in the wake of World War II, and it's still paying big dividends to this very day. And I would challenge anybody to identify, just how many friends does Russia or the Chinese have to have some kind of a similar arrangement. It's pretty, ever since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, there's really nothing out there. So I think that's a really very strong and healthy feature of our posture and the West's posture in the world. So I think I'd stop there and allow some time for questions. I talked longer than I thought I would, but I always do. So, question? No, you don't have to. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, raise your hand when you want to speak so we can get the microphone to you.
You didn't touch on North Korea and sort of what they could pose a risk or stoking some disruptions. Any opinion how to deal with North Korea and their actions?
Nothing's worked. And I'm very hesitant to venture an opinion because I think they're kind of wacko over there, and I'm just not entirely certain how to deal with it. I think if they ever, they get more and more dangerous with all the weaponry that they've been testing, and the nuclear tests they've conducted. And we used to have these six-party talks in the Bush administration vis-a-vis Korea, and that was a pretty good setup, I thought, with China, Russia, Japan, ourselves, and the two Koreas. But they never got anywhere, and so I think we've been stumped by that one, and I think we kind of play it by ear. But in the meanwhile, South Korea is, in a very good position to defend itself, and of course we have a very strong alliance with them. We have 30,000 troops or whatever in South Korea, and we'll be there for them. Yes, John.
I guess another area that is of interest to us is the Middle East and Iran in particular, and the situation over there. What are your thoughts on
Well, they've shown their true colors, haven't they? And those who were advocating that we continue talks with Iran, I think it's a bit of a fool's errand. And I think when they, I don't know about you, but I kind of made up my mind when I heard they were going to start selling their drones to Russia. I mean, they sort of made a choice there that was pretty important. Look, well, you lived through 1978 and 79 and saw what happened to Iran. It's basically people of the same philosophical bent that are still in charge of Iran, and I'm personally of the view that the only, viable, sustainable, longer-term solution is the replacement of that government. I'm not saying we should go and try to do it, but I think that the Iranian people, I'd like to hope that one of these days they might be able to rid themselves of this very difficult regime. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. What are some of the potential geopolitical flashpoints that we're not talking about?
Well, I don't know about political flashpoints, but let me talk about some of the areas of concern. Of course, I guess the one that would come most quickly to mind would be India and Pakistan over the issues that divide them, whether it's Kashmir or something else. China and India, they've still got unresolved, wherever you have unresolved border disputes, whether they're Russian frozen conflicts or something else, some historic difference over territory, you have that risk of conflict breaking out. You've got disputes between Japan and China over some of the Pacific Islands. So, that's another area of difficulty. But I also think that there's some trends that are in the world that are maybe not flashpoints, but I think they're disturbing. I see in Latin America a general movement towards these populistic governments that are against free enterprise. But more than that, I have just not been able to live up to reasonable standards of governance, and that seems to be spreading, right? Colombia, Venezuela, of course, Nicaragua, so on and so forth. So Latin America doesn't look, it's always had challenges, but it looks considerably worse off today to me than it did when I started my diplomatic career. And of course that impinges to some extent directly on the United States because of the migration issue. Because a lot of those people, one of their solutions, at least the ones who are able, is to walk to the United States. Yeah, and a lot of them do. There was another question in the back there. One other thing I'd like to, you have some.
Sorry to interrupt your thought there, but
No, it's all right.
in terms of spheres of influence that you mentioned, that one of your last comments earlier was about Russia. How many friends do they have? I've been reading recently that they're gaining influence in Africa and other areas for the cheap, as they call it. How do you foresee that playing out over time?
Well, there's going to be that kind of activity on their part. I'm not sure how much they can really deliver to some of these countries. China is probably doing more in terms of the spending and the economic effort they're making to win friends and influence people. And look, we're talking about when you compare China and Russia, you're talking about two very different countries in terms of their economic potential. I think China is a peer country to ours in terms of its economy and its overall national strength. I think some people have this idea in Washington that maybe we can, delay or frustrate China achieving what it's, aspires to achieve, and I'm not sure that's going to be so easy. Let me just in closing, because I see I'm running out of time. These are notes I took a year ago about just couple of weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, and this was a top administration official talking to a small group of us about what President Biden's instructions to them were, and he offered 4 points. He said, these were the guidance from the president. Maintain unity of NATO, and I think definitely we've been true to that. I think they've done a good job on that. Help Ukraine defend itself, give them the means, and we've certainly done that. The importance of a rules-based international order. And lastly, we do not want an armed conflict between the United States and Russia. So I think the president has really stuck pretty well to the guidelines he himself set 1 year ago when we entered into this situation. And I think I have to hand it to the administration for the way they've done this. It doesn't remove the uncertainties about what might happen in the future, but I think he's done as good a job as he can. So thanks very much for listening to me, and appreciate the opportunity.